Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Humanities Week 8. I do apologize that I was unable to be present for our seminar. It was unfortunate, but I wanted to provide you with a video that you could review that'll help you and guide you a bit while you're doing your Week 8 assignments. And I also wanted you to think about cultural revolutions within the context of American and world history. So I've constructed a PowerPoint here, and I'm going to run that and then come between it and online resources just to kind of give you an idea of where you can go to access content. So Week 8, you have an assignment this week. The objective of the assignment is for you to consider cultural revolutions on societies. And in our discussion this week as well, you're looking at the same. You're looking at cultural revolutions. Some of you are talking about musical revolutions, specifically within the context of your own experience. Some of you are expanding and looking at musical and cultural experiences outside of yourself. But the assignment this week asks you to do that. You are asked to interview two different people and have them consider the concept of cultural revolutions as it has impacted their lives. And I want you to think about what that means, because, cultures, we've talked about this to, a large degree, but we live in very different spheres of culture. We have our family culture, our personal cultures, we have our local community cultures, we have our larger state, regional, and then national cultures. So with that kind of framework in mind, you may want to ask the two people that you select, ask them to consider what cultural revolution looks like to them prior to sitting down to the interview. Give them a chance to kind of chew on it. Maybe even come up with questions that you have them reflect on prior to the interview so they can have really well-defined answers for you. But think outside of your own box and consider the perspectives of different people. And I'm going to give you a little bit of historical context for our own history on cultural revolutions that may help kind of spark that inspiration. You're not required to prepare a transcript of the interviews. For you out there that may be kind of new to all of this, a lot of times when we do oral interviews, you record them and then you have to type out the answers, and that's the transcript for the interviews. But you don't have to do that. You do need to take notes and have enough content that you can contribute to your resource that will allow you to answer the assignment questions. And your questions to all the assignment questions, your answers rather, should be between 500 and 700 words in total. Right, so part 1 and part 2 together should be between 500 and 700 words. Now, if we look at the rubric that I'm going to use to grade you, look up here. For an A, to get an A on this, your assignment submission introduces the subjects for the interview, offers a thorough, detailed, and organized summary of the interviews. The assignment demonstrates meaningful conclusions from the interviews and shares thoughtful application of the role of revolution in cultures. So you'll need to do some research on whatever cultural revolutions your interviewees are talking about, so that you can reference. You are expected to use APA citations as always, applying key concepts from the readings. This is not just a personal reflection based upon your opinion and their opinion. You need to construct an assignment that is framed around reliable information from your .edu or your .gov websites. And of course, also museum websites are encouraged. This assignment needs to be clearly organized, and then you need to meet the length requirements to receive full credit. So it is a formal assignment. It needs to have a cover page, it needs to have a title, it needs to be double spaced. All of the APA guidelines need to be followed. And if you're interested in getting more information on conducting interviews in our course resources right here on our home page. When you click on that, you'll see the course documents here, and then you can download and open up the PDF file that'll introduce you to interviewing. Okay, so that's how you can get access to the inside documents that will help you with this. Now, what about citations? A lot of you have been asking me. I did send out an email with a link to how to use APA citations for your interviews. But, you know, we are Purdue, and Purdue has one of the best online APA guides out there. So here's a link for you. If you just put into a Google search Purdue OWL, it will bring it up. And what the Purdue OWL APA says is no personal communications, which is what you're actually engaging in because you're not transcribing it. You do not put those in your reference list, but you do cite them in the main text. So in your part 1 and your part 2, when you're referencing what your interviewers have or interviewees have said, you will use this citation format right here, which is E. Robbins personal communication from the day that you interview. Okay, so it's the person that you interviewed, the fact that it's a personal communication, and the date. All right, so that's how you will provide APA citations for the actual interviews. And just so you know, when you go into Purdue, it will look like this, Purdue APA. And look over here. Look at all this great information. Purdue APA style gives you in-text, basics, authors, everything that you need you can find here, right? So make sure that you're using this resource. It's for us by our university here, and is a very strong resource. I've been using this for years. So good stuff there. Now, back to our presentation. Where was I? I was here. So I was talking to you about cultural revolutions, and I thought it might be a good chance to kind of put into context some of the revolutions that we're seeing today, and understanding, you know, the foundations historically of where they come from. So a lot of revolutions that we see today with the women's movement, with LGBT, with issues dealing with migrant workers and migration, immigration in and out of the country, issues with our political systems, right? A lot of these constructs, well, some of them go all the way back to the foundations of our country, but a lot of them come out of the results of World War I and World War II. So we go back to the 1940s and World War II. Remember, and well, if you don't know, World War II comes about 20-25 years after World War I. World War I is the first global war. There's millions of people who die. It changes the framework of war, because now there are planes, there are these chemical weapons, there are, you know, these automatic weapons, new types of tanks, new types of guns, and so there's a massive destruction that occurs on a large scale. And for the first time in our Western history, the majority of those who die in World War I are civilians, right? So we see a shift in who's actually being impacted. And what happens is after World War I, both the U.S. and Western Europe go into an economic depression. We know about the Great Depression here. Well, it also hit Western Europe. And so what happens is after World War I, Germany and those Central Allies, they become the focus of Reconstruction. And it said, okay, Germany at large is responsible for what happens in World War I, and they're going to have to pay the reparations. And it comes in the idea of the Treaty of Versailles, which is this coming together of other European powers, France, you know, England, the U.S., and they say, okay, Germany, you know, you can't have a standing army. You're not going to be able to be expansionist anymore. You have all of this, you know, you have to pay back. And what that does in Germany is it creates this like ultra-nationalism, right? It's the idea that Germans feel, and when I say Germans feel, I'm just talking at large and based upon the resulting consequences, but there is this this feeling of persecution. And so this ultranationalism, there's a space, if you will, for the rise of this really radical right-wing party in Germany. And it's given credibility by mainstream voters because of the economic situation that Germany finds itself in under the Treaty of Versailles, that says that, you know, Germany is fully responsible. And even the Rhine, even their own waterways are being protected and regulated by outside sources. So, you know, they feel there's an invasion on themselves there. And so this new party promises to rearm, promises to reclaim German territory, promises to, you know, regain international respect. And that's going to be very alluring, right? If you're in an economic situation where you find yourself between a real severe rock and a hard place in the middle of an international economic depression, after all of this devastation, someone who's giving you that kind of hope you're going to turn to. And so there's this sentiment that occurs, and so because of the fragility of the situation, voters are overlooking the more radical tenets of what the Nazi ideology is. And why am I telling you all this? Because when it comes to cultural revolutions, this plays a large role in how the U.S. is going to engage as well. So when we talk about cultural revolutions, I want you to think outside of the box. I want you to think about, of course, music, of course, the celebration of art. But what is culture? Whose culture are we talking about here, right? And what experiences have your interviewees had when it comes to cultural revolutions? Because, you know, in Germany in World War II, or before World War II, we see a major cultural revolution. We see it all over Europe. And the reason that Hitler is able to gain power as well is because a lot of people don't have jobs. And even though the Treaty of Versailles said he couldn't, he did begin to expand his military, and he put people to work in the military branch. And so he's going to get support from people there. It allows him to invade Poland. There's no one really able, you know, in the world, you know, regulatory systems at the time to stop him, because everyone in Western Europe is suffering from the Great Depression. So he's able to expand the military, work with the Soviet Union to create this new power block and begin to once again create a military kind of state. And there's not really a lot of attention at that because everyone is suffering. Incidentally, we talk about cultural revolutions. Think about the images of the Third Reich. You know about the swastika. But the swastika is a cultural appropriation of an ancient civilization, the Indus Valley civilization, in what will become India. 10,000 years ago, a very peaceful civilization, a place where people come from the east and come from the west to come and trade. They're an advanced civilization. 10,000 years ago, they had running water. They had natural air conditioning because they had designed their streets in a geometric form that allowed to take advantage of the natural wind routes through there. They were a group of people who took in and allowed for trade from all these different places. And they didn't just trade goods for money, but they also trade ideas. And so the Indus Valley was a place of real cultural celebration. And the swastika, as we know it, was really a religious sign of peace. And even today, in the Hindu and the Buddhist traditions in the East, the idea of the swastika is attributed to that, a peaceful society. And the reason that you have like the Aryan nation under Hitler and the idea of this, you know, Germanic superiority is because there is a real twisting of this history in the Indus Valley civilization. Now, the Indus Valley civilization, they disappear sometime around, I want to say about 8,000 BCE. We're not quite sure what happened to them. The only records we have to really associate, you know, that part of our history is called the Vedas, V-E-D-A-S, the Vedic epoch. And what this is a long historical poem that was written by the Aryans. Now, the Aryans come into the Indus Valley, and then a few generations after they come in, their ancestor, their descendants rather write the history. So it's kind of like if your great-grandfather came into a new place and then you wrote the history of your great-grandfather. And so the Aryan Vedic said, oh, these whiter-skinned or lighter-skinned northerners came into the Indus Valley and they dominated these brown-skinned, inferior groups, and, this is how this area establishes its hierarchy. The Vedas, these stories become the basis for Hinduism, the basis for a class and caste system based upon race. But again, the idea of this Aryan superiority and the use of the swastika as this evil kind of idea under the Nazi regime is not accurate or true to the history. It's a cultural appropriation. So what about cultural evolution as it looks like when we see the overtaking even of a group, right? So cultural evolutions can be a lot of different things. And so, there's this combined, the original ideas of combined dualities of male and female and of harmony. And of course, we see where that goes, right? Because the Nazi regime is going to be anything but. And you talk about cultural change. By 33, the regime creates the first concentration camps. And in that, we have any kind of political opponents, LGBT, any kind of religious group that is considered dangerous. That includes Catholics, the Romanians as well. You've got any people of color are going to be in this group. People with disabilities are in this group. These are the first groups that go into the concentration camps. And then right after that, the propaganda of racism is spread. And those who are suffering in the economic depression take hold of these ideas because it gives them some sort of hope, right? So for the first 6 years of Hitler's dictatorship, because once he's voted in, he then declares himself a dictator. Well, actually, once his superior is removed, he comes in and claims a dictatorship. And then, of course, there's a targeting on German Jews, right? And restrictions become more and more steep on their public and private lives. So we see the confiscation first of Jewish property. We see Jews having to wear identifying clothing. They are being identified by just one name for men and one name for women. So we begin to see a dehumanizing aspect when it comes to taking away their names. They're forced into these camps. The Germans turn on their allies not too long after that. And what we see is mass shootings in the Soviet Union, and by the fall of 41, Germany has turned on the Soviet Union, and they're entering into the Soviet Union with gas bans. So, major cultural shifts that are going on for all kinds of people. What does it look like for the average, Aryan German, if you will? Let's just call them Caucasian. What does it look like for the average German Jew, right? So these cultural evolutions have very significant and different perspectives based on who you are and where you are. And what I'm asking you to do in your interviews is consider those different perspectives, right? Because this is where we end up with the cultural and political and social revolutions that occur, largely based upon war and the economic crisis that occurs afterwards in World War I. This is where it carries Germany. This is where it carries, Europe. And this is not just occurring there. There are sentiments that are growing and impacts that happen here in the U.S. too. But, again, part of that cultural change, part of what happens here, besides the property, they're stripped of their citizenship. There begins the deportations. Now, we hear about this. We know about this in the U.S., right? But the America First Committee says that we don't want to get involved, right? Hitler wants us to believe that all of this, new order and troubles are coming, but we are not going to be fooled. We are not going to get involved. We're staying out of it. We're going to bring all of our troops back. We're going to, this is a white man's war. It's not true. Our real peril is other places, and we need to be focused on that. And those who are leading this sentiment of we are not going to get involved, Henry Ford is one of them. Father Coolin, which is a very staunch, he's a preacher in the South that's talking about nativism, and also, I'm trying to think of the word for it, but he talks about, he talks about fundamentalism, right, in religion, but he also has a very anti-Semitic narrative. So he's speaking out against engaging. Charles Lindbergh, a capitalist, speaks out against engaging. But not all of this is just about, staying out of war. I mean, after all, Ford, our Ford business was in Germany. There were several Ford plants in Germany, and Ford didn't want to give up his business. So if we went to war against Germany, that would be a conflict of his corporate interests. And so that was part of why he was saying we shouldn't get involved. This anti-Semitic support. Ford was known to have sent Hitler money, and when Hitler and the Third Reich comes into power, the Ford plants that you see right here, up in the right-hand corner here, these are all French slaves that are being forced to work in the Ford plants in Germany. So, this is something that's going to be impacting us. And what does that mean for our own culture? Is that a cultural revolution for us? So war begins for us, right? We are going to be going to war. And many men, are going to enlist. Millions of men enlist. It opens up a place for women. All right. So now we're going to talk about revolutions that occurs in our own country, in our own identities. Change that's coming. Rosie the Riveter, the idea that yes, we can and we can do it, and women are strong. Even women of color. Look at this. Breaking down, gender and racial barriers. World War II allows many openings and opportunities for women because all the men are going away and the home front has to be protected. And so women are encouraged to come out. Look at all these different posters here. Now, one thing you might see in some of these posters is something like, "Good work, sister. We never figured you could do a man-sized job." So even though women are being encouraged to come out and do the jobs that men had been doing, there's also still a strong bit of paternalism that tries to reinforce that inferiority of gender, while also beseeching to women that need to, come in and take over these jobs. So don't forget that. So, but, women are in uniforms, right? Free the men to work on the front lines, take on those clerical roles, the supporting roles. Women come out, they're out of the workforce, and they're doing their jobs. And once women become, get access to these public spheres and these spheres of working, it's going to shift. It's going to change. There's a cultural revolution that occurs because now women have this new exercise of autonomy. Trying to relinquish that is going to be, or not to try to relinquish it, but trying to hold on to it and not relinquish it is going to cause a cultural revolution. Meanwhile, what gets us into war is the bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese. We had cut off their oil supply, and they bomb our Hawaiian harbor. We were not prepared for it. It was devastating, and that's going to create a rise of anti-Japanese sentiment. There's a concern that Japanese Americans may, be a threat to us, and so what happens is the president signs these executive orders that say that anybody of Japanese descent, whether they were born here or not, you have to go into these internment camps. And so all of these Japanese Americans who had been living here, they had businesses, they had homes, they were forced out into these internment camps, these hastily constructed camps. Some of them were no more than horse stables, and they had to live there behind these fences for several years. Now, keep in mind that, for those of you that own homes, or heck, even if you're renting, if all of a sudden you're required to leave your home, your job, your business, and for several years you're away, when you do get out, you've lost everything, right? And so this is what's facing the Japanese after World War II. And not just that, but now there's going to be this new racism towards Japanese Americans. Very loyal people, right? But because of this us versus them ideology, because it was, a group of people in a different place that bombed, that share a certain heritage, there is this rise of racism. And so we see it there, right? But we also see, as part of our cultural revolution, a challenge to this very specifically designed racist action of internment, and that comes in the Korematsu versus the U.S. case. The Korematsu case, Fred does not want to go to the internment camps, rather. He refuses to go, and so he takes his case to the Supreme Court, and ultimately the Supreme Court says that the president does have the executive privilege to, to create protections in times of, crises that may impact groups of people. And so that's the outcome. But in this revolution, we see these challenges from new groups of people that are, again, being challenged in new ways. So there are cultural revolutions that occur just with certain groups of people. Think about these concepts when you're doing your interviews. Now, back to women. After the war, women have been hard at work, but all the men come home and they want their jobs back. They want their power back in government. And so now all of a sudden women are being pushed back out. They're being encouraged to return home and to the family. And so what we see in media are these very distinctive messages on what the role of a woman is, right? Rigid gender roles. And it also comes on the rise of a strong economy where you can have a one-parent income, one income families, and you can do quite well. And so we see that paternalism, right? No more Rosie the Riveter, but, a woman on her knees serving her husband, right? Make sure that you get fresh coffee or you could get spanked. I mean, this is going to spark the second wave of feminism, right? Women have come out of the homes, they've been working, and now you're going to push back. We're going to see that kind of pushback on what it means to have protection of body and protection of rights when it comes to work. The first wave of feminism is indicated a little bit earlier in the turn of the 20th century, 1900, when women were trying to fight for their rights to vote. And then the third wave of feminism that comes up around the 1980s is going to talk about, again, the idea of class, the idea of race, right? And there becomes this concept of intersectionality, that groups of people can be struggling for the same thing and yet have very different objectives and goals. And in that are very different cultural revolutions, right? Because if you are a woman, an African-American woman in New York in, let's say, 1975, part of the Black Power movement, your concern is about class and about creating community, about, kids and education and making sure they have free breakfast and free lunch, making sure that children are being fed. If you are in the Chicana movement of the La Raza, which is in the Southwest, your concerns are about migrant workers. It's about fair pay. If you are a white woman in the 1970s, let's say in Chicago, your concern is breaking down these male-only spaces in public spaces, male-only clubs, making sure that women aren't being treated differently when it comes to pay in the workplace. This is where we start seeing challenges by women, like in flight attendants, where women had to be a certain weight and be single and look a certain way, and we see challenges to this. So depending on what group identity you may be with, you may be identifying with, you may be experiencing, your cultural revolution is very specific. If you're an indigenous group in the American Indian movement, which is in the same period of time, you're talking about colonialism, the loss of land and property, the forcing out, and the idea of the U.S. as a separate national entity. So there are very different revolutions that are spawned and sparked off of this very tumultuous global moment, or Western global moment at least. Now, back on the home front, women are pushing and fighting for their rights after, World War II, and we have what becomes known as McCarthyism. The Cold War brings this new suspicion on people. Are they Americans? Are they patriots? Do they believe in democracy? Or are they communists? And so because of this fear-mongering and this space, again, that occurs after World War II with the removal of all these troops out of Europe and the returning of all these men, we see, this new Red Scare and these new investigations and suspicions of people. And the Red Scare is going to impact other groups. So LGBT, the Red Scare is prompted to, for the hunt of people to make sure that they are not engaging with communism, and it allows for and affords the opportunity for, intolerance when it comes to lesbians and gays. And understand that during the earlier period in World War II, and what we see are places and spaces for people, of different sexual orientations to create their own public spaces and their own organizations and their own voices that are public. And so we see a pushback on that. And so the president signs the executive order that says that persons whom there is evidence they've engaged in sexual perversion may not be employed by the federal government. So what we see in 53 is a executive order that blocks lesbians and gays from accessing federal jobs. And the reason that the justification that's used for this is that, people who are gay or lesbian have a higher risk of blackmail by communists. And right in that is a very duplicitous kind of concept, because what you're saying is we're not allowing you to have access to the federal government because we ourselves discriminate against you. And because you were not supported and embraced by your government, that makes you a person who could be easily blackmailed, because if a communist finds out you're gay, they could use that against you. Well, how can they use it against you unless there are people who are intolerant against it, right? And so this kind of mentality creates a new cultural evolution. We see pushback. The first gay group, the Mattachine Society, out of Chicago. Harry Hayes is going to lead them to D.C. He's going to be fighting for protections for LGBT. In San Francisco, you have the Bilitis group. This is the first strong lesbian group, and they're going to target the restrictions on public clubs, and they begin to address discriminatory laws. You have Stonewall, which happens in New York, and this is a violent attack on a gay and lesbian club. And so what we see are days of protests. Harry Milk is going to be the first elected openly gay man in San Francisco. So we see political power coming out of this. But, at the end of the day, let me go back. At the end of the day, revolution that occurs in our country after World War II is very expansive. You have the civil rights movement, the African American mid-century civil rights movement, led by Martin Luther King and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. You've got, again, the Chicana, the La Raza, the Chicano movement. You've got AIM, the American Indian movement. You have the women's movement. All of these different cultural revolutions that occur within these larger frameworks of political and social unrest and change. And so what I'm asking you to do this week in your presentation, or rather your assignment, is to consider what cultural revolution really means for your interviewees. Think about it. Construct questions that help you get to a place where you can look at cultural evolution from their perspective, but then also frame it in a larger perspective. And if you do that, you'll be very successful with this assignment. So I hope this has been helpful. I do look forward to our seminar in week 9. I will hold an additional supplemental seminar in week 10 to make up for week 8 if you're interested in coming. I like to hold one just for anyone to come in and last words kind of thing. But again, I'm around if you have any questions. I really appreciate all of your patience and your continued effort in the class. And I look forward to seeing you on the discussion board.